This is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is a very special episode of Anti-War News. This is only the third interview we've done, and we have a very, very special guest here, Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. He is a trauma surgeon, an American trauma surgeon who recently volunteered in Gaza, and he has been involved in organizing letters from all these American healthcare workers that have been in Gaza and talking about the atrocities and the horrors that they saw. And he's been doing kind of a media tour on mainstream media and everything. So I really appreciate him making the time for us. Dr. Sidhwa, how are you doing today?
Good. How about you?
Good. So again, I really appreciate you being here. Really, the first thing I want to ask, I know you and Dr. Perlmutter and other doctors and nurses who volunteered in Gaza kind of have a history of volunteering in conflict or disaster zones. Do you have that history as well?
Yeah, I've worked in Ukraine 3 times since the Russian invasion. I've worked in Haiti and Zimbabwe and in Burkina Faso and in the West Bank too. So yeah, no, I've been lucky to go to a lot of places like that.
So what made you decide to volunteer to go to Gaza? And again, what was this, March and April of 2024?
Yeah, I went in on March 25th and left on April 8th. You split your time as you can, obviously. Like I mentioned, I've been to Ukraine 3 times. But when the October 7th obviously was a major event, and then after that, it was clear that Gaza was just being destroyed, and that's we can say Israel is doing it, but that's not true. It's Israel and the United States that are doing it together. And so since I'm responsible for it, I figured I should go and stand with the victims. Same reason I went to Ukraine. Honestly, I think the U.S. has a lot to do with that war. You can say it's good, you can say it's bad. I don't really know, but the Russians don't need. Furthermore, I'm not going to join the Russian military, so I can go work in the Donbas. So I figured that working in Ukraine made sense.
And then, so how did you get into Gaza? That was when the Rafah border crossing was still open, and then you volunteered at the European hospital in the south.
Correct. Yeah, I was at European Hospital in the southeastern edge of Khan Yunis, like you said, we went in through Rafah. Back then, you could fly to Cairo, go across the Sinai, go into the Rafah gate, and then go north on Salahuddin Road to get to European Hospital. Now, of course, Rafah's, as far as I understand, the Rafah gate's been destroyed, physically destroyed. But the Israeli military won't let anybody go in through the Egyptian side, so now everything's controlled by the Israelis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's been closed since May. I mean, that's been so long now since they took the
Rafah if I remember right,
crossing.
they took it on May 7th. Yeah.
So you're a trauma surgeon. Your job, entails things that, you see a lot of gore and bad injuries and things that most people aren't used to seeing, things that most people probably couldn't handle. I know myself included there. So, there's a lot here, but what was it specifically about what you saw in Gaza, even compared to other war zones like Ukraine, that you found to be so horrific?
It's just a different thing. I mean, there's nothing. I've never seen anything like the Gaza Strip, honestly. Even including, like, I worked in Hebron in the West Bank, which is sort of the worst part of the West Bank. Just there's nothing like Gaza. In Gaza, what we have is a half child population that's been made completely homeless, is under physical attack. I mean, it's just obvious that civilians are a focus of the attack. The civilian infrastructure, if civilians get in the way, that's their problem, and is being starved and has had their healthcare system destroyed. It's pretty unusual, and I don't know of another. And maybe you can correct me, but I don't know of another time that such an attack has happened on any place. Even when the U.S. invaded Iraq, it didn't destroy the hospitals. It didn't starve the population. When the U.S. invaded Vietnam, actually, to be fair, it did try and starve the population in some ways. When we attacked Korea, we did starve the population in some ways, but didn't destroy the hospitals, didn't displace the entire population. So it's kind of a unique group of factors, all being brought together. And, there's a reason it's being investigated as a genocide by the International Court of Justice.
Mm-hmm. And then I remember the thing that really stuck out to me when you first sent that open letter, which I think was signed. The first one you did was signed by 44 American healthcare workers who volunteered in Gaza. And I think it was an interview that I saw with Dr. Perlmutter, who you and him were together in Gaza, correct?
Yeah, we met there actually. Yeah.
And it was an interview with him, and also this was mentioned in the letter, that every day or just about every day you guys saw a child that was either shot in the head or the chest.
Yeah.
And there is no way around that not being intentional. And again, this was in your most recent letter, which was signed by 99 healthcare workers, and the New York Times op-ed that you wrote, that was 65 of you. Pretty much everybody said that that's something they saw on a daily occurrence, was the gunshot wounds to the head. And the thing I remember really struck me about Dr. Perlmutter's interview was that, he said he was talking about toddlers. So, is that something that you saw as well?
Yeah. So just to be clear, what the Times piece and the way everybody understood that question was young children. I'm not talking about people who are 17 and 356 days old. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about small children, preteen children. That was how we asked the question in the Times article. In other words, you're visibly children. Like, there's no concern that this is a young adult. No concern that this is even a fighting age child. Because you could it's certainly true that a 15-year-old can carry a rifle. Maybe even a 12-year-old can sometimes. But an 8-year-old girl, no. I'm sorry, I can't really believe that. A 2-year-old girl, definitely not. So we're getting into the realm of completely being ridiculous at that point. It's just I went on a show with a fellow named Noam Dorman. He describes himself pretty honestly as a pro-Israel guy, and fine. And he said, well, isn't it possible that some of these kids were killed in the crossfire? I said, yeah, that's entirely possible that some of these kids were killed in a crossfire. Does it seem reasonable to assume that in a war where only one soldier a day has died, meaning I'm talking about Israeli soldiers, obviously, where one Israeli soldier has died per day, that's it, that in the catchment area of every hospital in Gaza, a small child is being shot in the head on a regular, if not daily basis in the crossfire? No, that's not believable. I'm sorry. If the UN, if some independent organization organizes a fact-finding commission at some point and investigates the case of 50 killings of kids who were shot in the head, and it turns out that every single one was justified under the laws of war, okay, fine. But just the probative, prima facie, obvious, on its face evidence certainly says otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And then, so I know when you came back, you guys were there for about 2 weeks. And then you started connecting with other healthcare workers who were in Gaza, and they started saying they saw the same thing. I think it was you who I saw said that you thought it was maybe a particularly sadistic Israeli sniper that was in the area, but then this is a pattern across all of Gaza.
Yeah, exactly. So exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I wrote in the Times piece, and it's not an apocryphal story. It's true. Geez, there must have been some lunatic running around Khan Yunis shooting these kids. And, every army is going to have some crazy person in it, and the army doesn't have much incentive to control them. They're going to do crazy stuff. And we've seen, there's no shortage of social media videos of Israeli soldiers bragging about the brutality. So that was what I assumed. But then, I went to I'm trying to remember what conference it was now, but I went to some conference and I sat next to Thayer Ahmed. He's another physician who's been over there. He's an ER doc. And he was at Nasser Medical Complex on the western side of Khan Yunis at a totally different time than I was there. So in other words, it's unlikely that the same crazy sniper happened to be around, right? And he said the same thing. Yeah, I just casually said, yeah, I couldn't believe how many kids I saw shot in the head. And he said, oh yeah, me too, just every single day. And I was like, really? And again, it was obvious at the time we were talking about small children, not teenagers. And so then suddenly I got to thinking, that's interesting. And so that's where like the idea for the original letter came. And after that, I didn't know what I was doing in terms of organizing anything. So I tried to, I just kind of kind of naively thought that I would just send one text and all the doctors would read the letter and sign it if they wanted to. But it took like phone call after phone call after phone call to each individual person. It was crazy. Never try to organize doctors is my advice. But but once I, we wanted to release the letter right after Netanyahu's speech, so that's why we stopped at 45. But I kept getting signatures on it, and finally, I could never have imagined that this would have kept going for a year. But when October 7th was going to come around again, we said, let's try to influence the media coverage a little bit by re-releasing this letter. We changed it just a little bit because, like for example, and people are like, oh, these people are all exaggerating. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. I had several people reach out and say, hey, I can't sign the letter because I didn't see kids shot, because the original letter said on a daily basis that we saw children shot in the head. And some people said, yeah, I wasn't, there were 1 or 2 days where it didn't happen, or like, I'm a facial surgeon or facial reconstructive surgeon. So they only called me for the kids that were shot but didn't die. And so I only saw 4 while I was there. Well, to me, that I would have been fine saying, it's a letter of protest. It's not an academic study. I would have been fine just signing it, but I said, okay, let's change it to regularly or daily, so that we could accommodate more people. And I thought that was complete. That, and so when people say, oh, there's all these Arabs on this letter, or there's all these Muslims on this letter, they must be lying. It's actually quite the opposite. People took their responsibility to be truthful very seriously.
Yeah, and I mean, even 4, if you're there for 2 weeks and you see 4 kids, young kids shot in the head, I mean, that's too much. I mean, it's just
I agree. I completely agree. And you have to remember that one person isn't seeing every child who got shot in the head in Gaza. They're just in one hospital. You know what I mean? Like, it's like I had somebody email me and say, oh, well, this means that this number of, if you multiply the number of doctors by the number of days, that means this many kids have been shot in the head, and that's not that many. I was like, no, dude. Like, what are you talking about? What we have is evidence that when anyone who can report to the outside world is around, the kid is getting shot in the head on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. That's not accidental. Again, I've said this in other places. I don't think the Israeli army is like ordering people to shoot children. That seems very, very unlikely to me. Like, there's no way Yoav Gallant wakes up and says, yeah, generals, murder 10 kids today. That's the goal. That's ridiculous. But it's very obvious that they're tolerating this by their own soldiers. They know who they're shooting. I mean, that's not, the sniper scopes have video equipment on them. All of the drones obviously have video equipment on them. The soldiers mostly wear body cameras. So it's not like they don't know who they're shooting. That's absurd. That's a stupid claim. Or that would be a stupid claim if anybody were to make it. So this has been going on for a year. They know full well it's going on, and they're not doing anything about it. That's the same thing as setting policy. It's a policy decision not to intervene, right? Because the other option is that the entire either Israeli soldier, it's probably a combination of these two things, to be fair, but either Israeli soldiers are deliberately shooting children in the head, and some of them, obviously not every single one, are shooting children in the head, and the Israeli military is not doing anything about it, or the Israeli military is firing into Gaza so recklessly and with such wild disregard for the safety of children that they're accidentally shooting kids in the head all the time. I don't know which one of those is worse, to be perfectly honest with you. Those are the only, unless you think Hamas is shooting their own children in the face, and they're, that's again just an insanely racist idea. Which again I've heard people try to make, but I don't have I heard Noam Chomsky once say that even to enter into the realm of debate about whether or not the Nazis carried out the Holocaust is to lose one's humanity. And I feel like discussing that question, I would lose my humanity. So, yeah.
And so I think I've seen you actually discuss that with someone, and your response was that, I think this was in a Twitter exchange I saw you did, was that, if that was the case, if Hamas was shooting all these kids in the head, wouldn't you think one of their mothers, a single one of them, would have did that?
No, so including the 200,000 people who are thought to have fled Gaza.
Yeah.
How is Hamas intimidating them?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can go. As I've learned recently, because I didn't do anything with Twitter until the only social media I kind of ever had was my Facebook page, so my mom can see pictures I take or something. But I got on Twitter so that I could try to spread the letter around and things like that. And Yeah, I mean, people come up with all sorts of nonsense, and I got to be honest. I don't respond to any of those questions because I think the person I'm responding to will listen. I respond to them because other people might say, "Oh, that does make a little bit of sense." But usually, once you point out how insane the question itself is, people say, "Oh, yeah, good point."
Mm-hmm. So to get into the other kind of, killing of children, not just by Israeli snipers, but obviously thousands, tens of thousands have been killed by Israeli airstrikes. And so is that something, when you were treating people, that were hurt by airstrikes, that were crushed by rubble and things like that, was that also a high percentage of children and women?
Yeah, I would say if you combined women and children, probably 80-90% of what I saw.
Wow.
There certainly were men. Most of them were older. I would say elderly, but older men. Um, and occasionally a 18, 19, 20-year old, occasionally a 25-year old, occasionally a 30-year old. I never once got the sense that any of these people were combatants because they came in with their families for the most part. So. Um, again, you can say whatever you want about Hamas. Nobody thinks that Hamas is dragging their wives to the battlefield with them. So yeah, and just to be clear, like you're saying, the vast majority of people that we saw were injured in explosions of some kind, airstrikes, tank shellings, artillery, drone strikes. Who the hell knows? But that was the vast majority of even of injuries in children that we saw. Um, and yeah, and I mean those were devastating injuries. I'm a trauma surgeon, so my main job in the United States is to stop people from bleeding to death. But that was a lost cause in Gaza for a few reasons. Number one, the vast majority of people who came to who actually made it to the hospital alive, they'd been in the field for hours, sometimes days, actually, because the Israelis destroy a home. If you just run straight to it and try to get people out, they're just going to bomb it again. So you're going to get killed. So people have to hold off. They have to wait. There's plenty of just absolutely heart-wrenching video of small children who are trapped under the rubble, but they're trapped in like a space. They're not crushed, and there's just some little hole out to the outside world where they're just reaching their hands, and someone's just holding their hand and trying to keep them kind. It's horrible. And again, this is just done with such utter and reckless disregard. There's again two possibilities. One is that it's being done deliberately just to murder children, because the goal of the war is just to clear Gaza of its civilian population, which is what they said it was at the beginning. And actually they still say it regularly. Or it's just that they're attacking Hamas, but with again such utter and flagrant disregard for the safety even of children that they're just blowing up huge numbers of children all the time. Again, I don't know if it's worse if they want to kill all the Palestinians or if they're so unconcerned about their lives because they may as well be ants. I don't know which one of those is honestly worse. But again, I always try to bring it back to us. It doesn't really matter what the Israelis are doing. We have to take responsibility for what we're doing, and we're the ones sending these people who are, like we said in the letter, we can't fathom why you continue to arm the country that is killing these children. It doesn't make any sense. It's not even if you're just John Mearsheimer, for example, he's not some left wing guy. He's an American nationalist. He wants the United States to be powerful and to rule the world. And he says this is crazy. What does American power get out of this? Not very much. It's pretty dastardly, and the more you think about it, the worse it gets, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you think for antiwar.com, I follow this news every day, this horrific news, and some of these stories. I mean, just one of them should be enough, to stop this. I wish I meant to actually look this up before we started recording because I wanted to ask if you knew anything about it. There was one incident in a hospital in Gaza. I forget which one, but someone they ordered the evacuation of the hospital, and someone who worked there told the IDF that there's 4 babies, premature babies in a neonatal unit. Yeah. And then when they came back to the hospital, they found them dead and decomposing. There's more to it than that. And you're saying the story exactly correctly, but there's more to it. If anybody wants to read the details, Euromed Monitor is the name of the human rights group that I think first released this story. But this story has been covered extensively, actually by CNN, and very well, very, very well by CNN. And the details are unbelievable.
I forget the name of the hospital. I wish I could remember. I can't remember if it was Rantisi or some other children's hospital, but there were I can't remember, maybe 3 or 4 babies in a neonatal ICU on a ventilator. And the director of the hospital, according to him, and I don't see any reason to doubt him, said that he repeatedly told the IDF, we can't evacuate these 4 children. And they repeatedly said, you don't have to worry. We will take care of them. We will make sure they are safe and kept alive. Hospitals evacuated, power eventually dies. And of course, these babies can't just survive by themselves. Finally, some Palestinian journalist goes back in and he finds these 4 children literally rotting in their beds. It's just on, and they've still got the, of course, the power died a long time ago. They've still got their breathing tubes sticking out of their mouth. They've still got their IVs in. They're being eaten by maggots, and that's unbelievable. The fact that CNN reported that and it didn't cause an absolute outrage in the entire world. It wasn't some crazy, it wasn't like not that antiwar.com is not a crazy website, but it wasn't some left-wing alternative, relatively obscure website. If you work in the government or something, everybody in the government reads CNN. They report on it perfectly straightforwardly. They didn't pull any punches. They said exactly what had happened. And actually, I'll tell you that when I was writing the Politico article, Mark Perlmutter and I wrote a Politico article when we first got back. More of a story than the kind of the data-driven piece that I wrote in the Times. We discussed. I really wanted to keep that in there, and they were just like, "Sorry, this is it's kind of too much. It's kind of too much to even discuss." And I get it, because it's not. It's one of those things where if you don't spend time on it and you just casually mention, "Oh, by the way, the Israeli army allowed 4 neonatal ICU infants to die for no reason, just out of spite." It's unbelievable, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not an easy thing to believe, especially, and again, if you know the history of the conflict, it's a very easy thing to believe, but it's not an easy thing to believe if like I mentioned that guy Noam Dorman. When I was on his podcast, he told me, he said, I started learning about the conflict after October 7th. And the way he seems to have, I don't know for sure, but the way he seems to have learned about it is mostly by looking at online videos and stuff like that. If you've read the standard books on the topic, Benny Morris is not a left-wing historian, but if you've read his books on the topic, none of this will come as a great surprise. I mean, this level of brutality is unusual, to be sure, but none of it will come as a great surprise. It's nothing new. If you've read the major histories of the Lebanon War, it's nothing new. Israel bombing hospitals is nothing new. What's new is the U.S.'s enthusiastic support for all of this. That wasn't the case. Even Reagan cut off aid, or threatened to cut off aid. When Begin, when the Begin-Sharon government invaded Lebanon in '82, they basically just destroyed the entire place. It was a horrendous invasion. Killed 20,000 people, probably at a minimum. It was probably much higher than that. Destroyed a lot of Beirut. This is before Hezbollah even exists. Years before it exists, and all to counter what Avner Yaniv, the founder of Israeli Strategic Studies, what he called the Palestinian peace offensive. The PLO was being too peaceful, too reasonable. No matter what Israel did, they couldn't elicit a violent response from the PLO. Finally, they just invaded outright. The hell with it. The American media will go along with us. The American government will go along with us. But finally, it reached the point where somebody actually gave Ronald Reagan a picture of a 3-month-old baby that had both of its arms amputated after an explosion. And he called Begin and he said, you need to stop, because the symbol of your country is becoming a 3-month-old baby with its arms split off. It's kind of a famous moment from Reagan's memoirs. It's one of the only coherent things in there. And there's no reason Biden couldn't have done that. There's no reason at all. I seriously doubt that Ronald Reagan was a more decent human being than Joe Biden is, but Biden, he didn't do it. I don't know why.
Yeah, and that's just one case. Those 4 babies, or 3 or 4 babies who were left to die.
And there's tons. I mean, again, you don't even have to go to obscure places like Euromedmonitor.com or .org, whatever it is. You can just go to the mainstream now. Like the Washington Post just had a long article. Maybe it was on October 8th or 9th. I don't know, sometime in mid-October. About I think it was stories from 5 or 6 Palestinian families in Gaza whose loved ones are dead, but definitely not in the Ministry of Health death toll. there's no, you don't need obscure sources anymore. It's all right there in the open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things I want to ask you, but one thing I want to cover before I forget is another thing that kind of struck me from the letter was the statement that nobody saw any militant activity at the hospitals. And now, we're talking about this, the all the horrific things you saw in the hospital from treating people there. But the other element is that they have also attacked all the hospitals in Gaza, as far as I'm aware. At one point
Virtually
or another,
all.
they've come under attack, under siege. They arrest the staff, they humiliate them, torture them. Just recently, they just left the Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, just in ruins, basically, and detained dozens of staff members. Now there's only 1 or 2 doctors there,
including the director of the hospital, including the head of nursing, it's there again. It's all on video. Mm-hmm. It's not hidden.
So
it's outrageous. I mean, it's Sorry, I keep interrupting.
So my question was just about that. So you or none of these doctors saw any evidence of any kind of Hamas or militant activity at these hospitals?
No, it's totally bizarre and idiotic. It's important to remember that the Israelis have been claiming this since like 2014, at least, and it's just pure nonsense. Anytime anybody actually investigates this, they find it to be complete nonsense. There's no reason to think that Hamas is hiding under Shifa Hospital. If they were, you have to remember what the Israelis actually claimed. They released a CGI video on CNN. Everybody show, oh, look at this, it's amazing. It's like you're playing Resident Evil or something. It's like a 3-tiered bunker underneath Shifa Hospital. Okay, where is that? Well, we know where it is. It's nowhere, because after the 4th raid on Shifa Hospital, which finished when I was there, it ended on March 29th or 30th, if I remember right. After that, the Associated Press actually had a good article. And about the destruction and the blah blah blah. They said, "Oh, look at the Israelis say Hamas is over there and over here and over there." And then, but the end, I think the last sentence is the reason the reporter wrote the article, just so they could get that sentence in there. They said, you said that they asked the Israeli spokesperson. You had said previously that Hamas operated out of a bunker network, a network of tunneled bunkers underneath the hospital. So why did you attack the wards of the hospital? And the Israeli spokesperson just said, "Oh yeah, it turns out we were wrong about that. They were just operating straight out of the wards." Well, wow. Shifa, which is completely insane. Shifa Hospital for decades, literally for decades, has probably had the highest. I can't prove it, but I'm just exaggerating for effect. But it had the highest ratio of international to national staff in the world of any hospital on planet Earth. I'm quite sure of it. Mads Gilbert worked there for like 30 years, right? He's a Norwegian anesthesiologist and emergency doc. He worked there for like 30 years, and he never once saw anything like this. The only time anybody has ever accused Hamas of weaponizing the hospital in any credible way was after the 2014 war. So not during it, afterwards. Amnesty International pointed out, and it seems to be true, that Hamas used one of the outpatient clinic areas as an interrogation and torture facility. Now, that's brutal and terrible. Obviously, you're not supposed to torture people, and you're certainly not supposed to do it in a clinic. But the fact that they did this in 2014 for a few days certainly does not indicate that the hospital is some military command center. And furthermore, if the hospital was a military command center, why would they go take over a clinic and do this publicly? It's absurd, Mm-hmm. Furthermore, you can go back to 2008 and 9, the Operation Cast Lead, and you can read the Goldstone report, what's called the UN Fact-Finding Mission on Gaza report from then, and you can read it very clearly. They say they wrote very clearly that we interviewed dozens and dozens of Palestinians in Gaza for this report. Many of them were openly critical. I'm not quoting exactly, I'm paraphrasing, but pretty close. Many of them were openly critical of Hamas's brutality, its arbitrary detention, its arbitrary killings of Palestinians, and furthermore, its rocket attacks on Israel, which they felt sometimes put them and their families in danger, which of course it does. But they said never once did we receive any report from anyone of Hamas using Palestinians or any facility in Palestine as human shields. Never. And Amnesty International wrote a very, very long report. It's called 22 Days of Death and Destruction after Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 9. And they said exactly the same thing, literally exactly the same thing. They said we interviewed dozens of people. They were all very critical of Hamas. Not one accused them of using human shields. Not one. So if Israel is actually targeting military facilities, but Hamas is not using human shields, how does that explain the death toll? It doesn't, obviously.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, it's not just Israel doing this. This is also the U.S. because they provide them with most of their weapons. And
yeah, and I apologize to the viewer because every time I say Israel, I mean the U.S. and Israel because they are basically one unit in this regard. The Israeli military and the American military, just first of all, are very closely intertwined. I forget who it was, but somebody's described that. Probably plenty of people have described Israel as as a stationary American aircraft carrier in the Middle East, and that's not wrong. I mean, Israel is the linchpin of American control in the Middle East. It does all sorts of services that the U.S. can't really have its hands on. It tests weapons in Gaza. It does all sorts of crazy stuff, and it keeps the region in check. And you got to remember, the only parts of the region that are not under basically direct U.S. control now are Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Palestine. I mean Syria, but Syria's just been physically obliterated. It barely exists. And the U.S. has been kicked out of Iraq, but it still maintains troops there anyway, despite claims to the contrary. The U.S. is a lot of U.S. interests are served by this war. It's not that none are served by this war, but it's pretty dramatic to see how far the U.S. has been willing to go.
And it's, when we're talking about the hospitals, I remember right before they had El Shifa Hospital under siege. And right before they actually went in, John Kirby, the White House National Security Council spokesman, basically gave credence to these claims that there was a command center. He said, "Oh yeah, we've seen those claims. We think they're credible.
American intelligence confirms this, blah, blah, blah."
And Israel goes right in.
Just a bunch of BS,
And we saw what just happened in Lebanon. Israel put out one of these new CGI.
That's what I was just going to bring up. Yeah,
claiming there was Hezbollah gold and cash under the hospital. Which, even if that's the case, does that mean do you bomb money?
Thank you. That was my first question. It was like, wait, that's the best. That's what your genius, hospital people came up with, is that Hezbollah's Fort Knox is under a hospital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who would care? Why would that justify attacking anything?
And so. Yeah. And so what happened?
The BBC went and saw it. Yeah,
because there's journalists there.
Complete nonsense. Exactly. And any time that people actually have access to things to undermine Israeli propaganda, it turns out to be complete nonsense. And that's hardly surprising. Why would Palestinians tolerate? There are plenty of stories, again in mainstream press, of Hamas gunmen showing up to shelters, not to do anything, just showing up there probably to see their own family members, and being chased away by Palestinians, saying, "Look, you're putting us in danger by being here. Get away." Well, how does that exactly square with them using human shields? They're using human shields, but only if they volunteer for it. Are the Palestinians all suicidal? What is this? This is completely stupid. This just doesn't make any sense. Beyond that, exactly like you said, as soon as somebody could actually investigate these claims, because there was a foreign journalist, and it's important to remember that Palestinian journalists did go investigate these claims, and they found them to be complete stupidity. Mm-hmm. But because the American media doesn't listen to what they say, or at least nowhere near enough, they were ignored. But yeah, as soon as the BBC went in there, they said they gave us the keys to the hospital, and we walked around wherever we wanted. And we sure can't find this Hezbollah gold. But like you're saying, even suppose it was true. Suppose they found 2 armed Hezbollah guards at the bottom of this hospital and said, "Nope, you may not enter. This is our Fort Knox." That doesn't justify leveling a hospital. It's insane. Mm-hmm. It's completely crazy. Suppose I'm not at work anymore. I'm at home now. But suppose an American general walks into my hospital to visit his niece or something. You can't bomb nobody thinks that means Iran can come bomb the hospital. The Palestinians can blow up the hospital. If that were true, every Israeli hospital, it should be fair game for Hamas to just bomb indiscriminately. Nobody agrees to that. That's insane. Mm-hmm. The level of propaganda is just ludicrous.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point, because Israel actually does openly say, if there's one Hamas guy, a Hamas commander, or just a Hamas official in a building of, there was a report from 972 magazine, which is an Israeli magazine, that basically said they would sign off on airstrikes if there was a Hamas commander and they thought 300 civilians might be killed.
Yeah.
How is that possibly acceptable? And their reporting also found that they were purposely targeting Hamas members when they were in their homes.
Yeah. Do you remember the name of the program that does that?
Yeah. What was it? Where's Daddy? or something.
Where's Daddy?
Yeah, and that's like an AI program that they use.
Yeah, the overall AI targeting program is called Lavender, apparently. But where's Daddy?
Mm-hmm.
That's a sign of a very sick mind. I'm sorry, I don't know how else to say that. That is the sign of a lunatic running.
That's mocking a child. That's
yes,
mocking the children that
exactly.
you're killing.
Why exactly? Why else would you describe this program from the standpoint of the child that's about to be murdered? That I could not. When I saw that, I have to say, I've said that. I give like a talk to a community group every week now, and when I say that, some people actually cry in the audience because it's just so vicious and awful. I mean, what the hell? It's wild, it's insane. My sister has two kids. I don't have children of my own, but my sister has two kids. When I told her that, she almost cried on the phone. She's like, what is wrong with these people? And like, again, yeah, what's wrong with these people? What's wrong with us? We're the ones who are still giving Where's Daddy the ammo to actually do what it does.
Yeah. I mean, it is so horrific. And so another thing I wanted to get into was the death toll. The latest numbers from the Gaza Health Ministry put it over 43,000. In the letter, you and the 98 other American healthcare workers estimated that you thought it was over 118,000. That includes killed by Israeli bombs and bullets. Also people who are missing and presumed dead, which the health ministry numbers don't account for. And also people have died of indirect causes of the Israeli siege, like starvation. And if people want to check it out, I'll put a link to the letter and the website and everything in the description, because there's like a big appendix explaining.
The appendix is long and data driven. The letter is mostly about our personal observations, but the letter is a long data driven bit. So and I don't want to. I hope you don't think I'm contradicting you, but just to correct one minor thing, that's actually not we estimated 118,906 or some such number, but 118,000 deaths. But that's not actually our estimate of the most likely number of deaths. That is the lowest number that one can possibly come up with by looking at the available data. Wow. In other words, if the available data is correct, and to be fair, it may not be, but if the available data is correct, then at least that many people have died. That includes 62,000 who've died of starvation and starvation-related causes. Because remember, most people who die of starvation die of infections as their immune system gets weakened. And that's doubly true when you make them all live outside and take away the sewage system and take away the healthcare system. And also when there's such a huge proportion of the population that's under the age of 5, which is very, very unusual. 15% of Gaza is under the age of 5. That's very uncommon. Gaza is one of the youngest places in the world, if not the youngest. But yeah, so the way I did those calculations was on whatever the number was of Ministry of Health counted dead from violence. So it's just so people understand, the Ministry of Health only reports violent deaths from the conflict, and they only report people who arrive to morgues. And there's a reason for that. Like if you go to Dropsite News, they have a long interview with, I believe, the head of the Ministry of Health. I'm not sure how they got to him. I have no idea, honestly. But he is very, very clear about what their methodology is, how it works. When the morgue system completely broke down around earlier this year. And at the end of last year, basically when Shifa was attacked, and they hadn't made any contingency plans for that. He goes into great detail about when they had the Gaza media office contribute to the death toll, when they don't, who's included in the death count, who's not, and how they actually get at it. So, but the long and short of it is that you have to be an identifiable person who arrives dead to a morgue. Now, the morgues in Gaza are all attached to hospitals, and the hospitals are all, like you mentioned, under attack. So a lot of people are, like I mentioned, that Washington Post article where they talked about 5 or 6 families who had people die in the family who couldn't possibly be counted in the Ministry of Health death toll. Either they're buried under the rubble, or they died of an infection several weeks after surgery, and they were just buried. I can't remember the details of what was covered in the article, but they were just buried somewhere. Nobody bothered to take them to a morgue because either it was too dangerous, or what's the point of traveling all the way to the morgue just to have him buried somewhere else? So there was that. But we took the numbers in the Ministry of Health data, so the numbers that are known to be dead by violence. To that, we added the estimated 10,000 that are thought to be trapped under the rubble. But that estimate has been there since January. So again, we were as conservative as we could possibly be, and didn't just, we could have probably just doubled it, but we didn't. We just stuck with the 10,000 that came from the civil defense, the Palestinian civil defense in Gaza. Then we did the calculations based on the data from the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, for the numbers of dead from starvation related causes. Sorry, I've been giving interviews all day. And then finally, we added on 5,000 that we just estimated. And to be fair, that's an arbitrary number. But that was the most, we all felt that was a pretty reasonable, lowest possible estimate of people who have chronic diseases that can't get healthcare right now. And normally it wouldn't be necessarily reasonable to count those people as war dead, right? Because it's just true that any war will involve some major disruption of society, and that's going to lead to people dying of unavoidable causes that lead from the disruption of society. The hospital's too backed up, or one particular medication didn't get imported, or whatever it might be, and so they have a chronic disease that gets exacerbated. Maybe their high blood pressure leads to a heart attack that could have been prevented. Okay, fine. But in this case, the Israelis are attacking the healthcare system on purpose. That's very different. In this case, the U.S. and Israel are starving Gaza on purpose. So again, it makes sense to count those war dead, or to count those deaths as war dead, not just as unfortunate byproducts of the war. They're called direct and indirect deaths, but in this case, they're all pretty direct.
Yeah. And so another thing I wanted to touch on related to that, the starvation deaths, is I don't know if there's any estimate in there of the number of newborn babies that might have died, because as you mentioned, Gaza is one of the youngest places in the world. It has one of the highest birth rates in the world.
Yeah.
And this is from the New York Times piece that you wrote. I just want to read this excerpt. It says 25 doctors, nurses, and paramedics saw babies who had been born healthy return to hospitals and die from dehydration, starvation, or infections caused by their malnourished mother's inability to breastfeed and a lack of infant formula and clean water. And then there is a quote from Dr. Aman Oda. She said, "I worked in a neonatal ICU. Several infants died every day due to lack of medical supplies and appropriate nutrition. We had to make tough decisions about which very sick baby would be on the ventilator due to the lack of equipment. I saw a family bringing in their dead 3-day-old infant who had been living in a tent." So, I mean, and I've seen plenty of reporting about newborn babies dying regularly. And, I don't know if you have any number or ballpark estimate, but you talk about 60,000 who've starved to death. I mean, a lot of that number probably, it could be babies, could be newborn babies.
So starvation. Oh, sorry. Starvation is always going to affect children under the age of 5 more than anybody else. It would also affect the very, very elderly, but there are so few very elderly people in Gaza that numerically, I don't want to say their lives don't matter. That's not what I mean. But numerically, it'll be an insignificant number. And again, I'm not trying to contradict you by saying it, but we interviewed 65 people, 65 healthcare workers for that article. And I just don't want somebody to think that, only 25 said they saw this. Well, 25 said they saw these things. 8 said they didn't. And the rest of us didn't work in those places. So we didn't work in a neonatal ICU. We didn't work in the emergency room, wherever. I'm a trauma surgeon. No one is going to bring a starving baby to me and say, "Hey, help this baby," So of the people who actually worked in that setting, 25 out of 33 did see these things. And actually, in the open letter we wrote, I think, in the first one as well, from July, there was a pediatric nurse practitioner. I'm sorry, my throat's just killed me. Let me just grab some more water. But there was a pediatric nurse practitioner who had been. She signed the letter, and when she signed it, she just casually wrote in her email to me that every day I saw newborn babies come back to the hospital dehydrated, and eventually they died. And and that was the first time I had heard somebody say that they had seen this every day. That's pretty shocking.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because that means in her 2 weeks there, she saw almost as many um, babies die of dehydration and starvation as have been reported in the English language media everywhere, right? So that's pretty shocking. And this was Asma Tahash. And so I called her and I said, "Hey, Asma, look, I'm not. Please don't think I'm accusing you of anything, but I need to make sure that what you're saying is literally true. Like you." And she said, "Feroze, every single day, multiple to almost every day, more than one."
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And I could not believe that. I was blown away by that. And that was actually what got me to read the IPC reports for the first time, because I didn't realize. I knew hunger was a severe problem, and you could just see it from there. And I had seen the IPC's reports covered in some media, but I hadn't actually delved into them. And I do have a master's of public health, so not just not that makes me some genius or something, but it does mean I can understand the report. And so yeah, no, it's a major problem. And actually, I just the other day, actually, maybe just yesterday or the day before, I was reading well, maybe I shouldn't say who, but a human rights organization sent me a report that they're writing and asked me to just read it for medical detail. Like, is the medical stuff in this legitimate? Is what we're saying makes sense? And so I looked at the IPC's technical manual, and I actually hadn't realized something. In the catastrophe phase of food insecurity, which is the worst one, that in that phase, 2 people per 10,000 per day at least are dying of starvation related causes. And in children under 5, it's a higher rate in that level of food insecurity, or in that phase of food insecurity, which isn't surprising, because again, children bear the biggest brunt of starvation related deaths. So it's actually possible that the number is much higher than I estimated, because I just hadn't. The IPC's technical manual was 250 pages long, and I didn't read the entire thing. So it's entirely possible that I actually underestimated the lowest possible estimate of deaths from starvation. So like I said, the more you learn about this, the worse and worse and worse it gets, and it's just we have to stop what we're doing over there. It's completely insane. We're just destroying an entire society, and it happens to be a society that's literally half children. Yeah, it's just it's unacceptable.
Yeah. So on that note, I know you got to go soon. I mean, I'm at a loss for words a lot of times. I do a show kind of covering this stuff every day, and it's hard to just say how hard. I use the word horrific all the time, but I feel like I just say it too much. It's just hard to describe how horrible this is. That's not
it is
very different of a word, but
for me, what's hard to describe is the equanimity and the detachment with which people are just accepting it. And I don't mean you, obviously, but it's just, what the hell is the Biden administration doing at this point? I don't understand. How much more destroyed do they want Gaza to be? I mean, unless they're actually planning on killing everyone there, which may not be that kind of hard to. It's pretty obvious that the Israelis would be fine with that, but you would think the Biden administration wouldn't be, just because it would cause such an outrage if this continues for another several years. But there doesn't seem to be any sign of a change at all. I mean, I haven't even gotten an acknowledgement of receipt of the letters that I've sent. Nothing.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. I actually reached out to the International Crisis Center in Washington, D.C. They sent the letters as well. I know Ralph Nader's office has sent the letters as well. The letters have been sent to basically every senator, every congressman. My own congressman has never reached out to me about them. He's a Republican, but he's not. I don't think he's particularly interested in the Middle East. Just nothing. I'm shocked by it. It's just
Yeah, I know. There's a lot to say about it. But so I just want to kind of conclude with the call that you and these other healthcare workers made is for the U.S. has to stop funding this, has to start arming Israel. Again, at what point? How many atrocities? How many dead kids is it going to take? It seems like they'll let Israel do anything, and I shouldn't even say let. They'll help Israel do anything.
Facilitate Israel doing anything. Yeah. Which means we'll do anything. Yeah.
And so I think I mentioned this, I think, before we started recording, but if if everybody decides that this was a genocide that's being carried out in Gaza, and it looks like the way things are happening in North Gaza, that it's going to be completely undeniable soon.
Yeah.
I think what you guys have done is some of the best evidence of genocide for an American audience. I think when the history is written, people are going to look at this as how could they have not stopped at this point. So I just want to commend everything that you've done. And, my friend Kyle Anzelin, who I work with at antiwar.com, he was I think first one I heard to say, the doctors, the healthcare workers, volunteers are basically the foreign journalists. They're really the only ones going over there and being able to report back. And the hospitals, the most horrific things are happening at the hospitals. So again, I think what you've done is just so important. And how can people deny, say that you're all liars? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So another thing I wanted to thank you. You wrote a fundraising letter for antiwar.com recently, and you mentioned that you've been reading antiwar.com since college, which is very cool. So that means, and you've kind of digested alternative media for a long time then, right?
Yeah, the way I got introduced to the Israel-Palestine, so I was a freshman in 2000, a college freshman in 2000. That's when the second Intifada broke out, and for the first couple, it was the year 2000. The only website that actually worked was CNN.com, and antiwar.com. Actually, this is basically the only two. And they, but I would just read the news because you're a kid, you're away from home, you start to learn about the world. And then for the first, probably 5-6 weeks, the coverage even on CNN was pretty straightforward. Today, Israel used American helicopters to just destroy a bunch of apartment buildings. Today, Israel shot 4 or 5 more kids dead during demonstrations, and no Israelis were getting killed. There were no suicide. They were getting killed, but they were getting killed in the territories, not in Israel. No suicide bombings for the first several months of the Intifada, and I didn't know anything. So this seemed strange. And then I was walking through the Johns Hopkins bookstore. That's where I was an undergrad. I was walking through the bookstore, and I think it was the second edition or the updated edition of Noam Chomsky's Fateful Triangle had been released that year, and I didn't know who Chomsky was, so I just said, "Oh, it says the subtitle is the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians." So I was like, "Oh, that's the book I've been looking to read." So I read it, and I was blown away. I was like, "What on earth? What is going on here? This is not something I'd ever heard of before." And then through a long series of other books and other sources, got to where I am. But I think it's important for people to realize that there are plenty of other sources of information available in the world. You can learn a lot by reading the New York Times, but not if you don't understand what you're reading. That's the issue. I think we've mentioned Noam Chomsky like 3 times already, but Chomsky used to say that if he was taken to a desert island and could only have one newspaper, it'd be the New York Times, because of its breadth of coverage, its depth. That makes sense. But if you don't understand the framework from within which they're reporting, it's very hard to understand how what you're reading actually relates to the real world. Mm-hmm. And so I think alternative media is more accessible in that regard to someone who doesn't want to carry out research projects in their spare time, because people work, people have families, so people are busy. It's not possible to just learn everything about the world and just we're not all Noam Chomsky. I'm certainly not, and so the ability to do that is limited for most people, including me. And so alternative media offers people, kind of a mode of intellectual self-defense. They can learn what's actually going on in the world, and they can think for themselves a little bit, and they can also realize that they're not insane for thinking the things they do. And most of the positions that you'll see on antiwar.com are probably majority American opinions. Like, for example, stopping arms sales to Israel is a majority American opinion. Now, it's for different reasons. It's not only for humanitarian reasons; it's also for isolationist reasons and other such things. But it's it's good to know that your neighbor might be thinking the same thing you are, and you've just been too afraid to ask them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know that feeling, kind of feeling crazy. When I first started working for antiwar.com, I first started submitting articles in like 2018 or 2019, and it was about the war in Yemen that the U.S. was supporting, and just nobody knew anything about that. And some of the brutality there is on par with what we've seen in Gaza. So when I got to know my boss Eric and Scott Horton, and all, it made me feel less crazy because it was a bunch of people who were aware of it and knew how bad it was. So it helps. And that's kind of what I do. Like my news articles, I keep them very short and kind of simple, but basically kind of try to take out or include the context that the New York Times would include, or kind of take out some of the propaganda that they slip in there. So anyway, again, I really appreciate you taking the time for the interview, for helping us out with that letter. Is there anything else you want to leave off with about just, how the U.S. needs to end this?
No, I mean, if people want, what we called for in our open letter was a meeting with the Biden administration. I got to be honest, I don't think it'll do anything, but if people want to support that call, they can go to GazaHealthcareLetters.org, and they can you can just send a letter from there. It's pretty easy. But yeah, I mean, this tells us something about our own level of culture, our own level of what our politics actually is. It tells us something that we don't have an anti-genocide mainstream party in the United States. The closest thing you can get is the Green Party, which is not going to win the election. So it's really we Americans have a lot of work to do before we live in a sane place that isn't destroying the world, and I think we better get on it.
Mm-hmm. All right, yeah, and I'll put that link in the description so people could go to the site and try to help out with that. All right, again, I really appreciate you coming on. I know you're happy to go do, I think, another interview you have, but keep up the good fight, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
All right.